And welcome to the Refinitiv Perspectives live stream on third-party risk and environmental crime. Environmental crime, or green crime, which incorporates crimes against wildlife and the environment, is estimated to be worth up to $258 billion per year. Now, it's one of the most lucrative illicit activities that policymakers and corporations are dealing with today. These criminal activities threaten our wildlife, affect business supply chains, and pose a danger to ecosystem stability across the globe. Now, importantly, some of these environmental activities produce pollution that impact the health and life of underserved and underrepresented people living in those polluted areas. As it relates to criminal activities, specifically around supply chain and the environment, which is what we're addressing today, we're finding criminals are exploiting the pandemic through supply chain fraud, cybercrime, and investment scams. The COVID-19 pandemic is a watershed moment, shining the spotlight on the global wildlife trade as a breeding ground for disease and opportunities for viruses to leak to humans. Our latest third-party risk report reveals that just 26% of respondents are knowledgeable about environmental crime and its associated risks, while at the same time, 65% of respondents are saying that they know or suspect third parties who may be involved in illegal or environmentally damaging activities. These numbers reflect the reality that more needs to be done, and it needs to be done quickly. Now, joining us to discuss this topic, well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Keesa. Nice to speak to you.
Great. So, Phil, let's start with the question that we just asked our audience in the live stream. Will the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic result in an overhaul of your supplier risk management policies and practices? It seems like a lot of folks are saying yes. What or impacts do you suppose are being made there?
Yeah, that response doesn't surprise me, Keesa. It's pretty much in line with what I'm hearing from customers and generally in the marketplace at the moment. I think supply chains have been under huge stress throughout the pandemic crisis. We know there's been several incidents of criminal activity exploiting that stress, particularly in areas like the provision of PPE and in the healthcare sector. So I think it's natural that many organizations will be looking at their supply chains, looking at their supplier risk management practices and processes, and making sure that they're doing everything they can to maintain a robust supply chain.
Okay. Well, let's jump into talking a bit more about those supply chains. What was the most interesting finding from the survey, the Refinitiv survey that we noted earlier, around how global corporations are managing those third-party supply chains? What was the most interesting finding for you?
Well, I think the thing that really jumped out for me and has actually been a theme we've seen in previous surveys is the fact that 43% of third-party relationships have undergone no form of due diligence whatsoever. And so, that represents a significant risk exposure from a whole range of crimes connected with money laundering, bribery and corruption, human trafficking, and as you mentioned earlier, wildlife trafficking. And so it is clear that organizations are still exposing themselves to quite significant reputational and financial risks.
So let's talk about the risks and let's talk about the costs. I know that there are specific costs and fines that you've seen over the last few years. How have those fines increased? What are you seeing there in terms of what they are? We speak about the severity of these crimes.
Yeah, well, the regulators continue to enforce for breaches of a wide range of predicate crimes attached to, as I said, money laundering, bribery and corruption. So, I mean, fines last year for breaches of the US FCPA Act reached 2.9 billion, and many of those were corporate organizations. Equally, we've seen a ramping up of enforcement for sanctions breaches, and I think as we have a more complex geopolitical environment as we come out of this pandemic, I think we'll continue to see changes in sanctions regimes and the focus of sanctions. So that also exposes customers to greater risk. So I think, and then of course we've got the fact that regulators are bringing in more regulations. So obviously in Europe, earlier this year, we saw the implementation of the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which is actually bringing in more organizations within the framework of the EU's anti-money laundering regime. And we've seen the EU a few weeks ago announce that they will regulate for corporate due diligence, particularly for environmental and human rights breaches in 2021. So enforcement's going up, and there are more regulations coming that people will need to be mindful of.
So we have the cost, the monetary value with the regulations. We have the tightening, if you will, of the regulatory structure and just bringing more regulations to bear. What other types of cost are corporations seeing that they may not be thinking about? And one, for example, I'm thinking about, Phil, reputational risk, which is huge because once a company loses that social license to operate, it becomes a bit difficult to get that back. What other types of risk outside of the money should companies really be thinking about?
Yeah, so you make a good point. I think reputational damage can be quite significant. And I think particularly when it pertains to incidents that relate to environmental or sustainable issues. So I think, I think companies that are exposed to things like environmental crimes, wildlife trafficking, or human trafficking, I think they could find that a serious breach would have a significant impact on their reputation if they're a public company, on their share price, and things like that. I think as consumers, we're all very much more attuned to sustainability and those kind of issues in the supply chain. So those are the risks that sit alongside the enforcement and, losing money to criminals, etc.
So share price impacting the bottom line, that sounds like a huge piece of the overall narrative. Let's talk a bit about the solutions that exist. So data and partnerships, how can those things positively improve a firm's due diligence efforts if they're looking for some clear solutions here?
Well, I think the first thing is it starts with trusted data, and clearly that would be one of the things that I would always recommend to my customers is, you need to be able to use data that can help you identify the risks that you have in your third-party relationships. I think here at Refinitiv, we partner with a large number of organizations that take our data and then apply that with their technology. Many of them are investing in some of the newer innovative AI technology to help improve the efficiency and effectiveness of being able to identify risks through the use of that data and technology. But I think the most important thing is that companies need to make sure that they've got robust internal processes and practices, that they are screening for risks in their supply chain or third-party relationships, and that they're using, as I say, data that they can trust to do that. I think those are the things that are really important. I mean, when regulators come in, if a company has found itself in a situation where it may come under regulator scrutiny, they're going to look to see what kind of practices and processes you've got in place, what tools are you using, and if you can demonstrate that actually, by and large, you're doing the right things and using the right tools, regulators will normally work with you. But if you're not doing that, then you can find yourself exposed, as I said earlier, to fines and other forms of enforcement.
We'll be opening up to the audience's questions shortly, so please get those questions ready for us. Meantime, Phil, you're just sharing that some companies may have set out plans and may have started making plans, and then COVID hit. And so when COVID hit, plans needed to change for most companies. And let's talk about supply chain risk in context of COVID. What long-term issues must corporations begin to plan for now that maybe they weren't considering 6 months ago or 9 months ago, but that really will impact the way they move forward from this point on?
Yeah, I think some companies will be faced with a number of challenges. The first is, we know that supply chains have become global over time. I think what this pandemic has identified has brought to life is that in some cases, organizations have supply chains that are heavily concentrated in a certain part of the world. And we know that it's been quite difficult for companies to be able to supply PPE equipment, for instance, simply because the supply chain is very concentrated in a number of countries like China and places like that where the manufacturers sit. So I think that's one thing that people will be asked to look at. I think, as we said earlier, we've seen criminals take advantage of the pandemic. Yeah. Frankly, nothing new, but, they've been able to reactivate dormant companies and position themselves as a potential supplier of medical equipment and things like that. And of course, we've seen quite a few incidents where companies or government agencies have placed orders with them only to find that, of course, they were fraudsters and that the equipment has never arrived. And, they've lost several $100,000s of dollars or euros, or in some cases up to millions of dollars and euros. So I think companies will need to continue to be, diligent and alert to the fact that even as we hopefully see this pandemic begin to ease, they will need to make sure that they fully understand the risk of the third parties that they're doing business with.
And it sounds like this diligence and alertness around understanding those third parties is really here to stay. It's not going anywhere. And I wonder, how can social and environmental considerations, that being a part of that, how can those things move into mainstream risk assessments and opportunity analysis? What does that path look like? Or do you feel that it's already mainstream?
Well, I think we're certainly beginning to see a convergence of your what I would call standard due diligence, which is around, as I said earlier, some of the financial crime related risks, the bribery and corruption related risks, the credit related risk of doing business with a third party. I think, we've begun to see that ESG has become more prominent. And we're seeing now that banks, for instance, are looking to invest in companies that they believe have a sustainable business model. And so I think, we're inevitably going to see a shift that says, as well as these risks that we're used to in the past, we now want to understand what is the environmental and sustainability policy for this company? How does it put that into practice ultimately? Are there any ESG related risks in its supply chain that may give us cause for concern around their investment potential and things like that in the future? So I certainly expect to see an acceleration of the convergence of ESG and standard EDD over the next few years.
So, Phil, if you were to give your top 3 or top 5 list, so to speak, we have ESG and enhanced due diligence. What are some other clear-cut solutions that can help a corporation, whether it's a small startup or whether it's a large corporate, that can help them fight green crime? If they were looking for a list of the top 3 or the top 5 things, what would you recommend?
Well, I think first of all, you need to be aware of the fact that, as we said earlier, things like wildlife trafficking is one of the fastest growing financial crimes today. Okay, so you need to be aware that you're exposed to that. You need to be aware that it could be in your logistics if you're in a logistic company. You need to be aware that it might be entering your supply chain if you're creating products that are based on animal products. But you need to be alert to it. I think you need to make sure you can have access to data that provides you with indications of where there may be wildlife or other environmental crimes in your supply chain. And then you have to have a policy for dealing with it. As we know, organized criminals and unfortunately terrorist groups in some parts of the world are collaborating together to commit environmental crimes. The logistic chains are quite complex, so often the animals are killed in Africa, transported to Southeast Asia, and distributed from there, right? So there are lots of points where you could find yourselves exposed to those kind of activities. But I think the first thing is be aware. The second thing is make sure you've got a policy for how do you identify that risk. And then, of course, you need to make sure you've got the right data and tools to enable you to do that.
Okay. Let's talk a bit more about the report that we talked about earlier. One of the revelations from the report is that institutional investors believe nearly 60% of listed companies are greenwashing by providing misleading environmental credentials, and 84% think this is becoming increasingly common. They're seeing it a lot more. How can we promote greater collaboration between law enforcement, regulators, the data that we have, the folks who provide the data, and the private sector to really combat green crime or greenwashing that we're seeing going on now?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think it's a complex area. I think it's not just about regulation. Of course, that's important, and I think, as I said earlier, we will see increasingly regulation in the area of ESG and placing more obligations on companies to be able to really prove that they meet the levels, of sustainability and environmental awareness that they say they do. But I think it's a bit like fighting financial crime back after the financial crisis. I think it's about tone from the top. I think it's about management teams taking responsibility for their environmental and social impact of their companies. I think it's about making sure that that it's part of a company's culture to build a sustainable business model. I think that's what investors will be looking for longer term. So it's a combination of, again, as I say, there will be some regulatory pressure, but I think a lot of companies and those that actually will emerge as leaders here will be the ones that take the steps themselves to ensure that they're adopting and developing sustainable business models.
So Phil, let's look at smaller startup firms and then let's look at larger corporations. I'm wondering, given the resource differences between a smaller firm and a larger firm, are there not differences in risk approach? So would you advise or consult a smaller company that has less money, fewer people? Would you advise them differently than large corporations? Or what would be the guidance for both of those? How would they differ?
I'm not sure the guidance differs that much. Look, I think there's a well-established process of taking a risk-based approach to how you manage your exposure to third-party risks and generally financial crime. I think, however, what I would say to small companies is, they need to understand that they're exposed to these risks. They need to make sure that they are implementing policies and procedures that will protect them. And, consistent with their budgets and things like that, they need to make sure that where they have high risk relationships, that they're taking all the steps they can to make sure that they're managing them effectively, and that they're aware of the risks that they're taking when they are doing business with third parties. But I know it's not easy. Look, many companies have a huge number of suppliers, and they don't have an infinite amount of resources to apply to some of these issues.
Sure. And if we look into the future, we talked about the size of the company. If we look into the future and think about the regions that are involved, would you say that we really should all be approaching this in the same way? Or do you another based on the regulatory history and based on what's going on there? Should some regions have more of?
I think, Keesa, this is a global issue. Yes. I mean, I think that, look, the countries that are most exposed to money laundering, for instance, are those countries that have the biggest banking system. So it's the US, it's, UK, Germany, France, Japan, etc. On the other hand, of course, the countries that may be most exposed to the original criminal activity are often emerging markets such as Africa and Asia, etc. So I think it's important that companies, wherever they are in the world, where they have third-party relationships, are taking the appropriate steps to make sure that they're protecting themselves from these kind of risks. So I think we're all in it together, to be perfectly honest with you.
And what a great way to wrap it up. Great guidance on how to prevent environmental crime. A company can, first of all, drive awareness, get access to good data, and finally build policies to deal with it. Phil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Keesa. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.
Sure. And we want to thank everyone for participating. And if you enjoyed today's episode, join our upcoming webinar on June 23rd on the rise of green crime to gain insights into challenges and solutions, as well as recommendations to combat green crime. Register by scanning the QR code shown on the screen now. Also, check out Thursday's Refinitiv Perspectives newsletter. Thursday's blog will focus on the environment, sustainable business, and the importance of Black Lives Matter. You can also find it on LinkedIn on Thursday, and you can visit my page as well on Thursday. This article was written by yours truly. Thank you all for joining us. Have a fantastic day and be well.